$27 billion. That is the size of the deal Canada quietly signed while Washington was distracted, arguing and looking the other way. No press conference dominated the American news cycle. No cable network broke into programming. No politician in Washington stood at a podium to explain what had just slipped through their fingers. And that silence, that deafening American silence, is exactly what makes this story so important. Because while the United States was consumed by its own chaos, its own debt spirals, and its own internal political warfare, Canada was executing a strategy that will reshape North American economic power for the next 20 years. This is not opinion. This is not spin. This is a financial shift happening in real time, and by the end of this video, you will understand why it matters more than almost anything else being reported today. If you have not subscribed yet, do it right now, because the analysis you are about to hear is the kind you will not find packaged like this anywhere else. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think America just handed Canada the opening of a generation? To understand the weight of what just happened, you have to understand the position Canada was trapped in for decades. For as long as anyone in Ottawa could remember, Canada lived in the shadow of a single customer. Roughly 3/4 of everything Canada exported flowed directly south into the United States. That is not a trading relationship. That is dependency at a scale most nations never experience. When your entire economy leans on one buyer, that buyer holds all the leverage. Every negotiation, every dispute, every trade threat carried an implicit warning behind it. The United States could apply pressure, and Canada, structurally, had almost nowhere else to turn. For generations, this was simply accepted as the natural order of things. Canada sold to America because America was next door, because the pipelines already ran south, because the supply chains were already fused, and because it was easy. And easy, in economics, is often the most dangerous word there is. Easy breeds complacency. Complacency breeds vulnerability. And vulnerability, when a partner turns hostile, breeds crisis. But easy became a liability the moment Washington decided to weaponize that dependency. When tariffs started landing on Canadian goods, when trade threats became a regular feature of the relationship, when the reliability of the American partnership came into serious question, something fundamental shifted inside Ottawa. Canada stopped seeing its dependency as a comfort and started seeing it as a vulnerability. And a country that recognizes its own vulnerability is a country that begins, quietly and methodically, to build an escape route. That escape route did not arrive with fanfare. It did not come as a single dramatic announcement. It arrived the way serious strategy always arrives, in pieces, in agreements, in deals signed in rooms far away from the American spotlight. And the $27 billion deal is the clearest signal yet that the escape route is no longer theoretical. It is operational, it is funded, it is moving, and it is already changing the balance of power on this continent in ways most people have not begun to grasp. Here is what makes this so significant from a purely financial standpoint. $27 billion is not a symbolic gesture. It is not a handshake photo op designed for headlines. It represents real capital, real trade flows, real commitments that lock two economies together over years, not months. When money moves at that scale, it does not move on a whim. It moves because institutional investors, sovereign decision makers, and national governments have run the numbers, analyzed the risk, and concluded that the future lies in this direction. Every dollar of that agreement is a vote of confidence in a Canada that is diversifying away from its single dangerous dependency. And every dollar of it is, whether Washington admits it or not, a dollar of influence quietly draining away from the United States, because trade is not just commerce. Trade is leverage, trade is alliance, trade is the invisible architecture that determines which nations rise and which nations stall. When you understand that, you understand why this deal is so much bigger than the number attached to it. Now think about the timing, because the timing is everything. This deal was signed at precisely the moment the United States could least afford to lose ground. America is drowning in its own fiscal crisis. Its national debt has crossed thresholds that would collapse smaller economies overnight. Its interest payments now consume more of the federal budget than almost any other category. Its credit rating has been stripped of its highest tier by every major rating agency. Foreign investors who once lined up to fund American debt are quietly stepping back, reducing their holdings, demanding higher returns just to keep showing up. And in the middle of all that turmoil, while every ounce of Washington's attention was consumed by internal firefighting, Canada made its move. This is what strategists call a window of opportunity. When your rival is distracted, overextended, and consumed by crisis, that is precisely the moment to act, and Canada acted, not with noise, not with provocation, but with the cold, calculated precision of a country that finally understood the game it was playing, and finally decided to play it to win. Consider the man at the center of this. Canada is being led by someone who does not think like a traditional politician. He thinks like a central banker, because that is exactly what he was. He spent years running monetary policy at the highest levels, managing sovereign risk, watching how economic pressure reshapes the fate of nations. When a person with that background looks at a trade war, he does not see insults or personalities or news cycles. He sees a balance sheet. He sees exposure. He sees a portfolio dangerously concentrated in a single volatile asset, and he does what any disciplined risk manager does. He diversifies. He does not liquidate the American relationship overnight, because that would be economically reckless. Instead, he systematically, patiently reduces the exposure. He builds alternatives. He signs deals in other capitals, with other partners, in other currencies. And he does it before the crisis forces his hand, which is the entire point. The best risk management happens before the storm, not during it. Anyone can react once the damage is done. It takes a rare kind of discipline to move while the sky still looks clear. That is what the $27 billion deal represents. It is not an emotional reaction. It is not a fit of anger aimed at Washington. It is a line item in a much larger strategy, one deliberate move among many, all pointing in the same direction, all designed to accomplish a single objective. Reduce dependency, build resilience, create leverage, and leverage is the word that should keep American trade negotiators awake at night. Because every alternative market Canada opens, every new partner Canada secures, every billion in trade Canada redirects away from the United States changes the negotiating math. A Canada with options is a Canada that no longer has to accept whatever terms Washington dictates. And that is a fundamentally different Canada than the one America has grown accustomed to pushing around for decades. The old assumption that Canada would always fold because Canada had nowhere else to go is quietly dying. And nothing is more dangerous to a bully than a target that suddenly has choices. Now let us talk about what this actually costs the United States, because this story was never really about Canada alone. When trade flows redirect, they do not vanish into thin air. They go somewhere. And every dollar of Canadian purchasing power that used to flow toward American goods, toward American farms, toward American manufacturers, toward American energy, now has the potential to flow elsewhere. American exporters who spent decades assuming guaranteed access to the Canadian market are now facing a future where that access is no longer guaranteed. American farmers who built their entire business models around Canadian demand are watching new competitors move into markets they took for granted. American manufacturers whose supply chains are fused across that border are discovering that the fusion they relied on can be redirected. This is the quiet, uncomfortable truth buried beneath every headline about tariffs and trade disputes. When you treat your closest partner like an adversary, you do not just apply pressure, you accelerate the search for the exit, and once that search begins, it rarely stops. Think about what this means for ordinary people on both sides of the border, because that is where the abstraction becomes real. For American workers in export-heavy industries, a shrinking Canadian market means fewer orders, fewer shifts, and eventually fewer jobs. For American farmers, losing reliable Canadian buyers means lower prices and squeezed margins in an industry that already runs on thin ones. For American manufacturers, every disruption in a cross-border supply chain that took 30 years to build means higher costs, and those higher costs get passed straight to the consumer standing at the checkout counter. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side, every new trade partner means new buyers, new revenue, new resilience, and a growing confidence that the country is no longer hostage to a single unpredictable neighbor. The $27 billion deal is not just a number on a government ledger. It is a redistribution of economic opportunity, quietly shifting away from a distracted giant and toward a partner that is finally taking control of its own future. And here is the part that most American commentary completely misses. This shift is not loud. It does not announce itself with a dramatic crash or a single day of market panic. It happens gradually, deal by deal, agreement by agreement, quarter by quarter. It shows up in the data long before it shows up in the headlines. It shows up in trade statistics, in capital flow reports, in the slow, steady rebalancing of who buys what from whom. By the time the mainstream fully understands what has happened, the structural shift will already be locked in. That is how the most consequential economic changes always unfold. Not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet decisions, each one small on its own, but together powerful enough to redraw the map. The $27 billion deal is one of those decisions, and it is a loud one for anyone actually paying attention. The people who understand this early are the ones who position themselves ahead of the change. Everyone else simply reacts to it after the fact. There is a historical rhythm here that every serious analyst recognizes. Nations that grow complacent about their trading partners eventually lose them. Empires that assume their dominance is permanent are always the last to notice when it begins to slip. History is full of dominant powers that mistook loyalty for permanence, that assumed the partners beneath them would always remain beneath them, that never imagined the day when the smaller player would build its own path. And history is equally full of the moment those dominant powers finally looked up, only to discover the world had already reorganized itself around their absence. The United States has spent so long as the indispensable economic center of North America that it stopped imagining a world where its neighbor had alternatives. But alternatives are exactly what Canada is now building, methodically and deliberately, in capitals across Europe and Asia and beyond. And once a nation proves to itself that it can survive and even thrive with reduced dependency, there is no going back. The psychological barrier breaks. The habit of assuming America is the only option dissolves. And what replaces it is a confident, diversified Canada that negotiates from a position of strength rather than fear. So where does this leave the United States? It leaves Washington in the uncomfortable position of having created the very outcome it should have feared most. Every tariff, every threat, every moment of treating a loyal partner like a rival gave Canada one more reason to look elsewhere. And Canada, led by a man who reads balance sheets instead of headlines, took every one of those reasons seriously. The $27 billion deal is the result. It is proof that the diversification strategy is not a bluff, not a talking point, not a negotiating tactic. It is real, it is funded, and it is accelerating. And the most dangerous thing for America is not this single deal. It is what this single deal signals about every deal that will follow. Because a country that signs one $27 billion agreement while Washington sleeps is a country capable of signing many more. This is not a one-time event. It is a pattern establishing itself, a precedent being set, a new normal taking shape while the giant next door remains lost in its own noise. The window is still open, the trend is still building, and the direction of travel could not be clearer. Canada is no longer a captive customer waiting for American permission. It is an active player, building networks, securing partners, and reducing its exposure to a neighbor whose reliability it can no longer take for granted. Every month that Washington stays distracted by its own crises, Canada gains ground. Every quarter that the American debt spiral deepens, the case for diversification grows stronger, and every deal signed in a quiet room far from the American spotlight chips away at a dominance the United States assumed would last forever. This is not the end of the story, it is the beginning. The $27 billion deal is not a conclusion, it is a warning shot, and Washington was asleep when it was fired. The tragedy for America is not that it lost a single negotiation. The tragedy is that it may not even realize a negotiation was taking place at all until the consequences are impossible to ignore. Now stop for a moment and think about what this really means for the balance of power going forward. Leverage, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to recover. When a partner discovers it has options, the fear that once made it compliant simply evaporates. Washington spent decades relying on a single unspoken assumption that Canada would always come back to the table because Canada had no other table to sit at. That assumption is now dissolving in real time. And when it is fully gone, every future trade discussion, every dispute, every negotiation will happen on completely different terms. The United States will find itself bargaining with a partner that can walk away, and a partner that can walk away is a partner that must be taken seriously. That is the true cost of what happened while Washington slept. Not $27 billion in a single deal, but the permanent transformation of a relationship that America always believed it controlled. So here is the question worth sitting with. When the history of this decade is written, will this be remembered as the moment America handed its closest partner the freedom to walk away? Because that is what is happening, quietly, deliberately, deal by deal, while the world's most powerful economy argues with itself and misses the shift unfolding right on its own border. The money is already moving, the strategy is already working, the map is already being redrawn. And the only real question left is how long it takes Washington to wake up and realize what it has lost, long after the losing is done. If this breakdown gave you something the mainstream coverage missed, subscribe right now and hit the bell, because the next move in this story is already being negotiated in a room you will never see. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Canada's strategy actually works, or is it still too dependent on America to break free? I read every single one, and this story is far from over.